I'm Ros Atkins. This week's World Have Your Say is live from London, but we've also a special report from Sierra Leone too. While we were there, we talked with lots of BBC viewers and listeners about the Western media's portrayal of Africa. Now, some of you all over the continent regularly raise concerns that it's too negative, so we wanted to explore the issue with your help. We'll play you the report and then there'll be plenty of time to discuss the issues live. So if you want to take part, all of our contact details will be on the screen throughout the show. Whenever World Have Your Say comes to Africa, we hear criticisms that the Western media is too negative about this continent. In fact, it happened when we were here in Sierra Leone 18 months ago. We broadcast a programme about the civil war and about reconciliation, and some of our listeners felt we were helping to entrench a reputation for war, brutality and hunger. Now, with an irony not lost on me, we're also here to gauge reaction to the Charles Taylor verdict and to talk about the Civil War. But we've also taken time to discuss with Sierra Leoneans whether the Western media is getting it right. As I was leaving the beach, one woman shouted at me in Creole, "You're only here to film the African monkeys," she said. I offered to film her comments and include them, but she declined. Another person with criticisms for me was World Have Your Say listener Al Hassan, who kindly asked us round to his flat.
Ross, look, I love the BBC, absolutely. But I think your coverage on Africa and the Africans has to improve. You guys inadvertently concentrate on the downside. Africans are poor, they are uneducated, they are uncivilized, they are barbaric. I think that has to change. You want to report? You paint a complete picture. How about our beaches? How about the hospitality of our culture? How about the extremely brilliant young Africans that have changed the world? How about African Nobel Prize winners?
And in the eyes of the critics, this perceived negativity of the Western media has consequences.
The tourism industry is one of those industries that is affected by the stories that come out in the media. It's very fragile, not just in Sierra Leone, but globally. We often have clients who, when they mention that they're coming to Sierra Leone, for example, the first questions that they get asked is, have they taken out life insurance? And then, of course, they come to Sierra Leone and they find out that Sierra Leone is nothing like the image that is actually portrayed in the press.
I wondered how the local media tackles this issue. Does it have a responsibility to focus on the positives in Sierra Leone and in Africa?
Good Morning Sierra Leone, the program
To find out, I visited the national broadcaster, SLBC, to be a guest on Good Morning Sierra Leone and to meet its Director General. One is to make a film for World Have Your Say's TV edition where we're discussing whether the Western media is too negative about Africa.
If we talk about good journalism, we talk about how important it is for us to cover far areas of the country and give people voices. And we talk about the mountain ranges, we talk about the sea view, we talk about the beaches that we have, so that we can attract people to see the good side of Sierra Leone.
And how do you go about telling the country about the serious problems there are?
We want to be very careful how we tell our own stories. When Africans hear bad stories from their African reporters, they feel that it's coming from a genuine background. And so we sort of appreciate the fact that, yes, we have searched ourselves, we are a mirror to ourselves, and we're able to say, yes, this is our problems, and this is how we can solve the situation. And again, remember, the Western media will tell you, well, it's not my problem, it's not my responsibility to provide solutions to you. The African audience have a feeling that, well, yes, it is easier, it is acceptable to listen to an African media telling my problems. When it comes to the Western media, we think there's some hypocrisy in the process of telling my story.
It might be easier for some Africans to hear bad news from the African media, but clearly the Western media is not going to stop reporting on countries like Sierra Leone, so it's about finding the right balance. Now, this country is indisputably incredibly beautiful. Its economy is surging too, and when you arrive at the airport, there are big signs welcoming you to the land of smiles. And if you did come here expecting despair and misery on every corner, then you wouldn't find it. But nonetheless, you don't have to spend any amount of time here in Freetown to see enormous amounts of evidence of abject poverty. And for foreign journalists like me and the rest of the World Have Your Say team, it's about trying to get that balance right.
Well, you should put that in your story.
Another World Have Your Say listener who got in touch was Theo Nicol. He'd called to ask us to attend a journalism seminar that he was organising. Of course, we agreed, and we invited one of the BBC's most senior African journalists, Josephine Hazley, to meet him.
The Western media is not treating Africa fairly. I think most of the time the issues are handled negatively. All the time you talk about wars, you talk about famine, you talk about sufferings of our people, and we have so many positive things to report, Josephine.
Tell me, don't you have wars in Africa?
We do have wars.
Don't you have famine in Africa?
Sometimes we do.
Don't you have corruption in Africa?
We do have.
Should we ignore them?
Well, we should not concentrate on them because we should be more positive. We have our music, we have our dance, we have our fashion, we have our beautiful women and beautiful roads and cities. So why don't you look at that?
I grant you that we should make more efforts to reflect the whole of Africa better. But the fact remains that we need to tell people about the evils, the injustices that are committed, so that if nothing else, they're not repeated. And therefore, we need to spread the word. If we don't tell people about the famine, how would we get help to come and help those who need food at that particular time? Do you think the BBC spends too much time covering the 10-year-old war in Sierra Leone?
Well, I'm not too sure the BBC spent too much time covering the war. I think basically what the BBC was looking for the negative sides of the war, was looking for the...
The war was not pretty. It was brutal. There were mutilations. There were sexual violence.
All well reported.
50,000 people killed.
Yes, we agree. But then we've moved on from that, haven't we? We've moved on from the war. Now we are doing development, infrastructural development. Let's spend more time on that than talking about the war itself.
If you do not take stock of the past, you will not be able to deal with the present. And as for the future, you might as well forget it, because the past governs your present and projects to your future.
I agree with you.
Well.
But at the same time, I still think we should spend more time looking at the positive things our country is doing.
That may be Theo's aspiration, but the Charles Taylor verdict has again made the Civil War and its causes the story that the Western media wants to tell. And again, Sierra Leoneans have divided over whether this is fair or helpful. One of the people who still lives with the terrible consequences of the war is Jusu Jaka, and he took me to the place where he was attacked.
It was on January 6, 1999, when the rebels invaded the city. January 20, the rebels went to my house and brought me at this mango tree. People were standing in the queue and petiting them. And then I was brought, my hands were at my back.
You want me to turn around?
Yes.
Okay.
My hands were at my back like this when I was brought here, and then eventually my hands were placed here, and then they were chopped off. The first left hand, and then the secondly, the right hand first was chopped. And then he has to pick up the hands and put it into the bag. And he said they're going to show their commander because they would give him more promotion.
So what do you say to people who argue it's time to stop talking about the war?
I think we must continue to talk about it for people to be aware of what is happening or what has happened. We have learned a lesson that we will never forget, and we will never go back to where we are coming from. I think we need to desist from what has happened in our country to say no more. No more, this would happen here.
There isn't anyone here who thinks that Jusu's experience isn't important. But there are some who believe, as one businessman told me earlier, that the war is the old story and that we, the media, need to find a new one. And for many, that new story is business itself. The economy is growing at over 30% a year. And if you are one of the men and women driving that economic growth, you might come here to one of Freetown's swankiest hotels for a drink, and looking at the view, it's really not hard to see why.
Nobody needs to tell me how brutal it was because I saw it up front, close, where people were shot right before me, family members, distant family members. And I saw my father's house being burnt down. Our house was almost burnt down. But the resilience that we have discovered that we have in Sierra Leone is the ability that we've been able to build back a situation where we've had 2 successful elections. Government's been changed in transition, and we must begin to tell the story. We have to start here in Sierra Leone telling them so that we don't tell these depressing stories. It doesn't help anyone. I wouldn't want to wait for the Western media to come and tell my own story. If we tell it very well, they will come. So this is what I think. We have to begin to rewrite our own story, tell our stories as loud as possible.
For all this positivity, though, some argue that the city spread out below Joe holds pressing stories which have to be told, whether they're considered negative or not.
The government is actually doing great with regards to developmental issues in the country. But I want to say there are yet lots that needs to be done with regards to health, with regards to education and water and proper housing. Like this house you are seeing here, the people in this house have to walk a few meters away to fetch water, and it's really difficult. And we really need to say the reality that is happening on ground. Yes, we know people are frowning at what the international media is saying, but this is the reality. And if they are ignoring that, the international media should not say things like this, then I don't think it's right. They need to say it, because once the international media keeps saying it, then it will prompt change, it will prompt action.
Well, many thanks to all of you in Sierra Leone for helping us make that film. I can see we're getting calls from Sweden, Uganda, Gambia in response. Do keep those responses coming. We'll get them on air in the next few minutes. We've also got guests in Nairobi, Accra and Johannesburg to talk about whether the Western media is too negative. So we'll take a break just for a few moments and then we'll be back to talk about these issues. Well, let's go straight across to Nuala, who's with the World Have Your Say team, where all of your calls are being taken. Nuala, what are you hearing so far?
Well, you know, I'm just hearing behind me here, Stephanie, one of our producers, is taking a call from a Sierra Leonean in China. That's John. He's just reacting to the film that he's just seen. And let me read out some more of the comments that are coming in. James says on Facebook, I tend to agree because this Africa of ours is the most beautiful place on earth, and why don't we portray this other brighter side of our continent? Juma in Kenya says, do we expect the so-called Western media to tell the world about peaceful transitions in Ghana and Zambia and close its eyes when police kill people for questioning election results in Kenya? We also had Marks in South Africa tweeting, when will the Western world and their media change their negative views about Africa? So you can keep posting at facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay or tweet us.
Nuala, thank you very much indeed. If you didn't get any of those contact details down, don't worry, they're on the screen throughout the show. Hi to all of you watching around the world. We're live here on World Have Your Say, talking about whether the Western media is getting its portrayal of Africa wrong. I can see more calls coming in from Kazakhstan, Cameroon and the Netherlands. We'll put as many of you on the air as we possibly can. Let me introduce you to our first 3 guests. Mandy Rousseau works for City Press in Johannesburg. She's their international correspondent. She's live from Johannesburg. Sean Bakare is a lawyer in Lagos, and Nanjira is a blogger in Nairobi. Nanjira, let me start with you. Do you think that the Western media is getting its portrayal wrong?
Well, it's not about getting it wrong. It's just telling the truth. It's not like all the stories that are being told are from a vacuum. The issue is where there are positive stories, and there are many, the same measure is not seemingly applied. And then that brings the issue of, you know, it'll be a fleeting statement about M-Pesa or something great out of Africa, and then back to the negative stories, maybe because for all manner of reasons, we feel that that's easier. So, I mean, or, you know, that's what the world wants to hear. But it's not so much about the fact that these stories are not true. And I love that new media through blogging and social networks is changing that perception. It's changing the fact that people are now able to tell their stories. The dissemination of information is now being democratized and being, power is back to the people to tell their stories. So also on our part, we can't always just be playing reactionary. We have to be proactive and use what we have to tell these stories. And it's like someone rightfully said, the media will pick up on what you're talking about as well.
Mandy, let's bring you in Johannesburg.
Look, what you have to look at is, what is the essence of news? News is when things don't go as they were supposed to go. And unfortunately in Africa, a lot of things don't go as they're supposed to go. So what we see often about Africa is the bad news, the conflicts, the famine, the hunger, the deprivation, etc. And as the previous person said, that is the reality. But we need to make sure that there is some kind of balance involved. But I'm a journalist, and I know what kind of debates we have around newsroom tables. It's certainly not a matter of let's just portray this continent as bad and there's nothing worthwhile going on here. Not at all. But I do think that you have to understand that when people do their jobs, when governments do their jobs, then, that's how things are supposed to be. People shouldn't rush out and, do stories about how fantastic people do whatever they're supposed to do. You do things because you want to highlight problems, you want to keep governments and people accountable, and you want to make sure that the story that is being told is one that is balanced and interesting, because otherwise who would be interested in listening or reading it? So I think that, yes, obviously there's a lot of negative news coming from Africa, and I think that that is also changing with more journalists taking the time to look out for better news stories. But at the end of the day, good news, when things go as they should, that's not news. For us, news is when things go wrong, where things are different than what they should be, and that's what we're looking for. And unfortunately, we find a lot of examples of that in Africa.
I'm interested to know whether everyone watching you around the world on the BBC agrees with that definition of news, when things don't go as expected, when things go wrong. If you're tweeting as you watch, we're using the WHYS hashtag. Sean, let me bring you in Lagos. I'm absolutely fascinated by this idea from the Director General of SLBC that it's easier for Africans to hear negative news from other Africans rather than from the Western media. Do you think that's true?
That's definitely not true. My perception is this. If you ask any Westerner, an average Westerner will tell you that Africa is a continent that is rife with danger. And then, of course, because every now and then you hear them say things like the Black Continent. And I think that such perceptions are fueled by the kind of news items you get on the news on a regular basis. But then, I do not have a problem with that, because if that was my problem, I would just have said it. But I think what my problem is the fact that when you report these things that you think are wrong, then when the right things happen, try and report them with the same vigor and fervor with which you reported the bad news. And I think that that's where I have a problem with the Western media.
Well, Sean, let me interrupt you there and put that point straight to Mandy in Johannesburg. Mandy, shouldn't you be reporting when things go right as much as you do when things go wrong?
Well, look at all the reporting we do around elections that go well in Africa. We've recently had elections in the DRC. It wasn't great, but at least we could say it didn't escalate into a civil war the way it did in the Ivory Coast. We reported that story with great diligence and a lot of enthusiasm. And so I think we do definitely try to make sure that when things have gone wrong and they're going right again, we want to make sure that that is known to people. But I don't think that there are that many stories of that going around. I mean, look at the coup in Mali recently, in Guinea-Bissau. Look at the situation in Zimbabwe. So I think that Africa gives us a lot of opportunities, unfortunately, to tell bad news, whether we want to or not.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, you're keeping us on your toes, all of you watching. We're getting calls from China, Canada, Ghana, Germany, Tanzania, Zambia, Malaysia and South Africa, just to mention a few. Let's pull up a message here for our guests to respond to. Blaze from Cameroon, posting at facebook.com/World Have Your Say, where, by the way, you can see the film if you'd like to watch it back. Blaze writes, positive stories get very little attention. You can choose to report the coup in Mali and not the successful election in Senegal. To every negative story, there are 10 positive ones. Well, I think for the BBC's side of things, we reported on both of those events here on BBC World News. Now, Njira, let me go back to you. I am struck when I hear these criticisms of the Western media that every time I go to Africa and I see the Kenyan media or the Sierra Leonean media, wherever it may be, the local press is full of negative stories. So is this really about the Western media?
I really don't think it is. And even when we talk about the negative stories, I don't think then to tell the positive ones, we have to deflect away from the negative stories. It's very true that even we have the same problem here with local media. And it's again what probably Mandy was talking about, that news is what is going wrong, what is not, right, or what is not the norm. And I mean, it's against that backdrop, then I then wonder, then why don't we start telling these positive stories that way? Because then Africa has always been tainted, by negativity, war, civil conflicts, poverty. Then if that's the story, then newsworthy items, there should then be the positive stuff that's coming out of it, In the very midst of all those atrocities, we could talk about, the positive things that are happening or how people are then coping or the ingenious ways people are dealing with these matters. If that's the news, definition that we're going with, both in local and international media.
Well, that is also interesting. People we spoke to in Sierra Leone said, we don't mind you reporting the problems, but you've got to report our solutions too. Sean, do you agree with that?
Exactly.
Well, I must say immediately that the first thing we must understand is that news is a reflection of the bias of the person reporting. I'll give you an example. Now, remember that during the apartheid, the anti-apartheid activists were called terrorists by certain section of the media simply because these persons had communist ideologies. They embraced the communist ideologies, and then the press men and women who were reporting their activities were people that were totally against communism. So I like to think that oftentimes when news are reported, it's usually a reflection of the bias of the person who is reporting. And then sometimes these things have to do with the ideologies and the impressions that these media houses have to follow. Sometimes they have policies that they must uphold, and then you see things like this going around. So for me, it's basically because the Western media have, as it were, interest to protect, and because this interest must be protected at all costs, then they churn out some of this news, and then the perception that comes with it is a reflection of their bias.
Sean, thank you very much indeed for your comments from Lagos. Mandy's in Johannesburg, Nigeria is in Nairobi. Wherever you're watching, you're very welcome to take part. In a few minutes' time, we'll have the editor of BBC Africa live on the programme. So if you've got questions and comments for him, get them coming in. World Have Your Say at bbc.com. Juma in Kenya says, who's blaming the camera for picking up the starving women and malnourished kids in Africa? Ruha in Saudi Arabia has just got in touch to say the media's not getting it wrong, it's getting it right when it comes to Africa. And Charles is watching us in Lusaka. He says, I was impressed yesterday when I heard news on Zambia's economic growth, and it is striking how many of those of you in Africa want more emphasis on what you see as the economic successes on the continent. Lots to talk about. We'll take a short break and then we'll continue our conversation. Is the Western media too negative about Africa? Still with us from Nairobi is Nigeria. Let me introduce you to two new guests, though. Solomon Magera is the editor of BBC Africa. Solomon, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Welcome.
And also joining us from South Africa, we have Zodwa Mukena, news anchor at 702 Eyewitness News and also a student. Well, Solomon, you've been watching our film, reactions to it. You must be aware of these criticisms from Africa as well. What do you say to people who argue the BBC and other Western media outlets are too negative?
Absolutely, I've been following that keenly. Those accusations, you would say, there's merit in those accusations, but others, yes, they can be challenged. For example, earlier on we had that a bad story about Africa is believable when it's told by an African journalist. So I'm wondering if a bad story is told by an African journalist who is not properly informed, whether it will still be a good way to go about it. So I want to challenge that a bad story, whether told by an African journalist or an non-African journalist, has got to subscribe to those basic requirements of being accurate and well-sourced and well-informed. You know, recently we had a program on BBC focused on Africa. It's called the BBC Africa Debate. And we wanted to know, what do people in the Asian countries like Pakistan Vietnam, and we went as far as United States to get to hear from ordinary people. What do they make of Africa? When they think about Africa, what image comes to their mind? And because they've been exposed to Western media, international media, as their only source of information, they had this to say: beggar mentality, poverty, colonialism, disease, and all those negative stereotypes you can never think about. You cannot blame them because their only source of information about Africa were those Western channels. But things are changing nowadays. You've got social media. People in a country like Kenya can definitely challenge anything they feel is negative about their country, and they did that recently when we had an attack in Nairobi, downtown Nairobi. We had a grenade attack, and one of the international channels went beaming saying violence erupts in Kenya, and Kenyans got cross with this. They were busy exchanging comments on Twitter, on Facebook, and sooner rather than later, that channel withdrew and apologized.
Solomon, it's good to have you on World Have Your Say. Those of you watching, if you've got points for Solomon, call up country code 44 2070 83 72 72. In a moment, we'll speak to our guests in Lagos and Johannesburg. But first of all, let me pull up this message from Ayobami in Nigeria, posting on our Facebook page. Whenever I pause to consider how Africans take criticism, it reminds me of the proverb, truth is a bitter pill. Well, Zodla, let me bring you in at this point. Do you think as an African journalist, it's partly your responsibility to report what's happening, but it's also your responsibility to promote your country to the rest of the world? Doesn't sound like she can hear me. Well, let me ask Tanuke, who's in Lagos, the same question. Tanuke, do you think Nigerian journalists need to represent your country's best side to the rest of the world?
Yeah, I really strongly believe they have to represent us in the right form, because usually I notice that Western media is always on us when anything negative happens. They are supposed to come out and listen and watch for more intelligent and positive issues. We have, Africa is more of, I mean, Africa has a lot of positive things that are yet to be seen, and usually they don't really listen to us when we have positive issues out in the news. They keep publicizing the negative ones, which is not fair. It's a case of us being bullied. It's a case of we all being in a secondary school and them bullying us all because they are more advanced, or they're more out there, actually.
Solomon, let me bring you in. As an African working for the BBC, is it in your interest to promote your continent as well as report on it?
Yes, it's more about reporting and accurately reporting, giving a fair representation of the continent. And yes, I'm an African and I work with African colleagues just to say that the BBC broadcasts to Africa, not just in English, but in 5 other languages: Kiswahili, Somali, Hausa, you've got Kenya, Rwandan, Kirundi, and of course French. And all these services have got African employees, reporters and producers. Those reporters are on the ground telling that story. The difference comes when you're dealing with an international channel that beams images at an international level. That's where this maybe our African languages don't have that capacity, unless of course they go onto the internet and they beam that onto the internet. But in terms of television, which is quite powerful, it's out of our control. It's out of the control of many African broadcasters. So if they've got what you call positive stories to project, they don't have that platform. But what's important is not to say we will not report war or famine or poverty, name it. We've got to report those events as they happen. What we need to do, and what every African journalist or any African for that matter needs to do, is to question the causes of those problems that give Africa that bad image. But what lies behind that? Ros, what is behind that war in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, in Mali, name it? Who is financing that war, for example? There may be...
Solomon, that is all very well, but let me bring in Zodwa as well from Johannesburg, because some people, a lot of Africans are saying to us, look, put the war on hold. You should be reporting how beautiful our continent is, how beautiful our women are. Lots of people said that to me in Sierra Leone. But Sodwa, is news about promoting the best aspects of a country? Is that what it's about?
You know, Ross, the world is ignorant. The world is going to believe what they want to believe about Africa. How we cannot, as Africans, try and see what the world puts out there to their people. I cannot go to the likes of America and say, this story is wrong, you reported false. The world is going to believe what they want to believe. As Africans, why are we concerned about what the world thinks? I'm more concerned about how Western media portrays me as a South African to my peer who's a Nigerian. That's where the problem comes in.
Well, how does the Western media portray you, do you think?
You know, when you report on a story that's happening in Nigeria or a story that's happening in Zimbabwe, I'm going to think in the mentality of a person who doesn't know what's credible and what's not. And you're going to tell me that my fellow Africans are distorting money from me. My fellow Africans are moving across the world because they need this and that. And I'm going to feel, why are they doing this and that? And I'm going to have a negative image of them. And that's how the Western media comes in. They embed images from others because, as we know, Western media is a #1 source of news for Africans.
Well, that's an interesting point. You say the Western media is the #1 source. Tanuke in Nigeria, let's bring you in. Much was said to me in Sierra Leone about how it's time for Africans to tell their own stories. Is that the best way of countering the Western media, do you think, to actually start putting out different messages through your own media?
How many Western media has come out to portray Africa in a very good sense? Whenever we're making sentences when we're talking on topics like this, we have to be really, really careful. Because media travels faster than, media travels faster than light to me. Because you can't say Africa is known for terrorism, Africa is known for fraud, and at the end of the day, you do not portray what is really interesting about this country for people to come in and see for themselves. A lot of Westerners or a lot of Western media come out to explain and talk bad about this country. Most of them actually say here is the home of terrorism, which is really, really wrong. Now, I keep asking myself, or I keep asking each journalist questions that you always say, here is the home of terrorism, here is the home of fraud and whatnot. You people don't make your findings properly. You don't do your investigations very well before putting out a report.
Well, Tanuke, it's difficult to respond to those criticisms because Tanuke, let me jump in. It's difficult to respond to those criticisms because they're not particularly specific. But Solomon, come in here. When you first moved from Kenyan media to the BBC, did you feel a pressure to focus on the negative? Did you feel a pressure to look for corruption or war beyond what might be called good news stories?
Well, that's a very important story because as a Kenyan or as an African journalist working for an international broadcaster like the BBC, those questions will be asked of me. Is that my agenda? No, not at all. In fact, as an editor, and I have been also an editor of BBC Swahili Service, at no one time did any of my other senior managers come to me and tell me, hey, Solomon, we need you to report more about this negative story than the other. No. We sit as African reporters and producers to set the agenda for that particular service we're working on a particular day. That's #1. But I just wanted to distinguish that from what some of my others have been saying on this program, that it's about the international images that are beamed around the world that inform some of these negative stereotypes we are talking about. And just to challenge that, a very key thing and point that we want to emphasize is lack of knowledge. Majority of international journalists who dive into Africa for stories normally will not have identified with the continent or with that particular country enough to report on it authoritatively. They rely on what we call a local fixer. You've got a guy there who you say, okay, I know you. Can you get me 2 or 3 people come and interview? Can you tell me about that region we are going to visit? Now that fixer you are relying on, how much does he know about the area you're going to report about? How objectively has he even selected those two contacts you're going to interview. The trouble is lack of knowledge of those areas we report in. And this is why we say that it's better to have somebody with an understanding of that particular culture, that particular country, that particular continent, to tell the story of that place in its own fair amount.
Solomon, thank you very much indeed. Dennis in Uganda has posted on Facebook, Africa has failed to develop an effective African media house that tells authentic African stories of progress and a continent on the move. It's striking how many African journalists have said they wish there was an African-based TV network to push the stories they believe matter. We've still got a few minutes left here on the BBC to talk about these issues, so keep getting in touch. We'll take a break and I'll be back in a moment. Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. Thank you very much for joining me on today's World Have Your Say. We're discussing whether the Western media is too negative about Africa. We just broadcast half an hour ago a special report we made from Sierra Leone on that subject. If you missed it and would like to see it, you can find it at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. Now, I know we've had a particularly big response to today's programme. Many calls coming in. Let's cross to Nula, who's with the team, who are answering all of your calls.
Indeed, you've been keeping us very busy over here. A ton of calls coming in, including from the United Arab Emirates, Poland and Japan, and that's just a few. Ethiopia, I heard Vincent is calling in there. Now, Abraham decided to use Skype, as quite a few did today, and he called in from Canada. He says the media has turned its back on Africa. If you look at Sudan, there's nothing that has been done to solve the problem. Journalists, Western journalists, will only cover one or two countries. Patrick Tucker, also on Skype from Senegal, he said, I don't think that the media is giving a biased view. Africans portray themselves in a negative light. And Francis wants to respond to Zodwa. He says, I'm Nigerian, and patriotic as I may be about my country and continent, I must admit that what the media reports is largely true. We Africans have been too complacent and too complicit in reinforcing the negativity about our people. Well, we're finding a very split opinion in the calls that we take, so we do hope you'll continue to call us.
Nula, thank you very much indeed. Let's switch from Nula in central London to Kiki, who's with us from Connecticut. Kiki, go ahead. What's your view on this?
I just wish that there was more balanced media coverage of Africa. Yes, there are negative events that occur, but I think that there is a space for there to be a positive narrative. I think that partially the gentleman who was on your program earlier was talking about the fact that international journalists often aren't well versed in African politics. I think that's a great problem. But I do think it's necessary to talk to more people on the ground and get a local perspective. I think then you'd hear more positive commentary.
Kiki, thank you very much. Let's switch from Connecticut to Johannesburg and speak to Zodwa from 702 Eyewitness News. Now, Zodwa, I love 702. I listen to it all the time when I'm in South Africa, but don't tell me you don't cover negative stories. I hear stories about corruption, about crime, about government inefficiency every time I turn 702 on. So perhaps this isn't about the Western media, it's just the media.
You know, Ross, we've got to be realistic, because negative news sells, and essentially news is about something new. Corruption, poverty re-angled is what attracts news. The question now should be is, how can we write more positive stories about Africa and use them to make Africa the world leading in news also? Because it's going to, world, or should I say rather Western media, are going to continue to write poverty stories that are happening in Africa, because that's what sells. How can we as Africans change that image? Easily, my solution is quite easy. We need to go to our local stations and tell more positive stories, and that's how the image of Africa will change.
Zodwa, it's been a pleasure having you on the programme. Nanjira, I was going to come back to you, but I'm afraid we're out of time. Solomon Magera from BBC Africa, thanks to you as well. Well, if ever there was a time that I wish I could stretch the BBC World News schedule a little bit and get more time to talk about this, it's today. We've had an enormous response. You can carry on the discussion at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. There you can find the film that we made in Sierra Leone as well. And I would like to say once more that if you are watching in Sierra Leone, thank you very much to all the listeners and viewers who helped us to make the film. Speak to you next week. Goodbye.